Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Stacy Wright from Phoenix MUFON, and tonight we have our latest installment of the Phoenix MUFON live streaming lecture series. And we have special guest speaker David Marler joining us tonight. So David, welcome. We're so glad that you are here. David has been a UFO researcher for the past 30 years. He's also held some offices within MUFON as a field investigator and as a state director. So he knows his stuff, and he's got some really interesting stuff tonight for us on a case coming out of Farmington, New Mexico. So David, please enlighten us.
Thank you, Stacy. And hello to everyone from Phoenix MUFON and also at large. Stacy and I were just chatting. I know there's so many people that would love to have in-person lectures again, but unfortunately, until we get a little bit further down the COVID road, that won't happen. But I think I speak for all of us that even though we can't meet in person, it's much more comfortable. I'm sitting here in my research room being able to present this information to you. And I have to say I'm very comfortable sitting as opposed to standing at a podium. And hopefully you're all enjoying a nice beverage while we go through this very important historical UFO case. And, I was thinking before we went on air that we just had the 71st anniversary of this case, and it is one of the most dramatic cases in the annals of UFO research and UFO cases that are on record. And I think you'll agree, especially since we're having Phoenix MUFON as our audience, when you think of UFO cases, landmark cases that are truly extraordinary, certainly the Phoenix Lights incident in modern times comes to mind. But I would argue that once we go through this presentation, I think you'll agree with me that this was the Phoenix Lights incident of the 1950s. It was extremely dramatic. We're going to be talking about broad daylight sightings of dozens to hundreds of unknown objects being witnessed by hundreds, if not thousands of people. And so with that, I will go ahead because we have a lot of information to go into and see if you can see my screen. There we go. There we are. And let me just pull this up here. And there we are. There we go. And hopefully you can all see that just fine. So, the flying saucer invasion of 1950, Farmington, New Mexico, and beyond. I don't use that term. Yes.
We can't see it yet, actually.
Oh, okay. Let's see here.
Were you able to hit the share button? Here it comes.
There we go.
There it is.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. There we are. Perfect. So the flying saucer invasion of 1950, for those of you that have attended my lectures, I don't try to be overly dramatic, but I use the term flying saucer invasion because quite literally, that was the terms that were being used at the time in the local papers in New Mexico. You can see there on the right, Santa Fe, New Mexican, Farmington invaded by saucer squadron. Huge saucer armada jolts Farmington, and the Las Vegas Daily Optic, which I'm happy to have an original copy of from 1950 in the archives, spaceships cause sensation. So this was something that was well documented at the time. We're not talking about an obscure sighting that people are relaying decades later. We have contemporaneous reports in the form
Sorry.
of... Yes.
Me again. From backstage. We can see the PowerPoint program. But at the, so I don't know if the right screen was shared or, yeah, you can do it that way too.
My apologies.
No problem.
Let's see here. Once we get this going, I promise we'll be fine. Let's see.
I'm going to sneak into the background again. Call me if you need me.
Let's see here if we can do it this time. Can you see that?
It looks like the program again. Do you have two screens?
I don't. I just have the one. So we'll just
go.
Up.
It'll go like this. It'll be like this.
We'll just go like this if that's all right for everyone. So
yeah, that looks good.
Absolutely. So these were the contemporaneous reports in newspapers, but we also have government documents, which I've investigated and through FOIA was able to obtain some of the various documents from the time period, which shed new insights into this. And even beyond New Mexico itself, we had other reports in other newspapers across the country as far as California, but this is one from Lubbock, Texas. Hundreds in New Mexico report mass flight of strange objects. Now, I always like to mention at the beginning, this is one of the most misrepresented and underrated cases in ufology. Numerous witnesses in Farmington alone, the local papers said, estimated 85% of the population, which was 6,100 at the time. So we're looking upwards of 5,000 people that have observed these objects back in March of 1950. UFOs were estimated in the hundreds. Detailed documentation, which we're going to review today, possible photographic evidence, but we'll have some skeptical eyes looking at that. And yet minimal serious investigations been conducted over the decades with regard to this. And it's interesting. I recently had a conversation with George Knapp, and he was extremely interested in learning about the Farmington incident. And he remarked to me, he goes, Dave, he goes, I'm just amazed that this has never been investigated more fully. And I had to really bring him back to 1950. In 1950, there really were no serious organized civilian UFO research groups. CSI New York hadn't formed yet. NICAP hadn't formed yet. Even APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, had not formed yet. So any investigations were almost retrospective in nature, looking at it years later. But we will talk about Dr. James McDonald later in the presentation, who did do an in-depth investigation. There were references to the case, though, in 1950. The year 1950 had one of the first flying saucer books published by Frank Scully, Behind the Flying Saucers. At the very end, he had a list of updated newspaper articles from 1950 discussing current UFO sightings or flying saucer sightings at the time. Farmington was one of those. But we have to really go back to 1950. I mean, it's really interesting when we think that this was just 5 years after the conclusion of World War II. Harry Truman was in the White House, and one of the major developments at the time was the hydrogen bomb, which, interestingly enough, was occurring. A lot of the work was occurring here in New Mexico at Los Alamos National Laboratories. And setting the stage, Farmington, New Mexico, for those that aren't familiar, it's up in the Four Corners region in the upper left-hand corner of the picture there. This was 3 years after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, almost 3 years after his sighting over Mount Rainier, almost 3 years after the Roswell incident. And it was during Project Grudge, the Air Force investigation into UFOs that was a precursor to Project Blue Book. And it was interesting because that period in time was referred by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt as the dark ages of the Air Force investigations. It was very anti-UFO within government and military circles at the time. Now, New Mexico also was host to another phenomenon that was occurring at the same time as the Farmington incident. In November 1948, green fireballs started to be sighted over southwest portion of the country, but specifically New Mexico. New Mexico seemed to be the epicenter. And frequency of the reports, they were describing these large luminous fireballs. And Air Force initiated a special project called Project Twinkle to investigate these green fireballs. And they enlisted the help of Dr. Lincoln La Paz, who was here at Albuquerque at University of New Mexico. And he worked with the Air Force personnel at Kirtland Air Force Base just down the road. And those sightings actually continued into 1951, but that was going on at the same time the Farmington incident was playing out. And then again, we're looking at Farmington there, very close to the Four Corners region. And the 3 days that we're going to be focusing on are Thursday, March 16th, Friday, March 17th, and Saturday, March 18th. So that's the time period, 3 days of UFO sightings in broad daylight that we're talking about. Now, it's interesting also to note that prior to the Farmington incident, there were other UFO sightings being reported that week. It really started Monday, March 13th, around 10 p.m. For those that have been to Roswell, New Mexico, if you go even further to the southeast, there's a small town called Hobbs, New Mexico. And even further out than that, you have an area called Eunice, New Mexico, which is really close to the Texas border. There was a couple driving around 10 p.m., and they suddenly saw this luminous red object that appeared in the sky. The object was moving from the west to the east, then made an abrupt turn, right angle turn, and darted off to the north where it disappeared. And this was reported in the Farmington Daily Times as well as other New Mexico newspapers. The following day, we had a sighting in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In this particular instance, a young man reported that he had seen a globe with rows of windows. And when I heard of that description, my mind went back to this classic graphic from Fate magazine, summer of 1948. And it makes you wonder if that is similar to what, in fact, he observed in the sky over New Mexico on Tuesday, March 14th. But really, Saturday, March 18th was the big headline. That was the local newspaper, the Farmington Daily Times, huge saucer armada jolts Farmington. And I just want to kind of walk you through some of this. Craft seen by hundreds, a little typo there on the part of the newspaper. Speeds estimated 1,000 miles per hour, altitude 20,000 feet. And at the very first paragraph is very important. For the third consecutive day, flying saucers have been reported over Farmington. Remember that, because that's going to be completely contradictory to the official government explanation that we're going to talk about. But it goes on talking about many people calling into the local newspaper, and they described numerous objects in the sky. From several to more than 500 were being observed in the sky at one time. And many of the observers were World War II veterans. Some were pilots. But what's a particular note is the third column there, a red leader. Scores described the objects as silvery discs. A number agreed they saw one that was red in color, bigger and faster, and apparently the leader. This is a common theme that was reported not only in Farmington, but other parts of New Mexico in reference to these sightings. And many of them said that they observed these, and moments later, there appeared to be anywhere from a few to 500. And they couldn't estimate size or speed because of the distance, but they did appear to be around 15 to 20,000 feet based on many estimates of the witnesses. The article continues and interviews a number of people. I'm not going to go into this. We'll talk about some of this throughout the presentation. But the third column there, you see a gentleman referenced in the middle, Mr. Marler Webb, another garage employee, said the objects to the naked eye appear to be 8 inches in diameter as seen from the ground. He described them as about the size of a dinner plate. Well, I gave a presentation for the UFO Congress last year, and I did a workshop on investigating historical cases. And if any of those that are listening now heard that workshop, one of the pointers that I put forth with regard to historical UFO research is never assume a witness is deceased. And this is one of those particular instances. Despite the fact the case occurred in 1950, I was able to track down the last surviving witness who is quoted in the 1950 article in the Farmington Times referencing these sightings. And here in the picture, you can see Mr. Marler Webb. Mr. Marler Webb is still alive in Farmington, New Mexico. Very successful businessman. For his age, he's now, I believe, 93 or 94. He is extremely sharp, extremely intelligent, very articulate. He was a private pilot for many years and was even in the naval. He was a naval pilot in World War II, towards the conclusion of World War II. But he had a sighting on day number 1, Thursday, March 16th, between the hours of 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. And he says he couldn't speak to the individual shape or color so much of the objects, but the fact that there were formations and the way that they maneuvered. And he did state that officials spoke to him afterwards and other witnesses, and in fact, on more than one occasion. The one thing I like to emphasize, though, to contradict any conspiracy theories that might be attached to this, he stated in no way, shape, or form was he or any of the other witnesses intimidated and not told to talk about it. So there was no intimidation. There was no conspiracy to silence the witnesses. I just want to be very clear, because often that type of dialogue gets pervasive into some of these cases. But we're actually standing on the location where Marler was on the day that he observed these objects. And he also provided this wonderful photo. This is what that location looked like in March 1950. What we're looking at is the Perry Smoke Chevrolet garage. And a very young Marler Webb was working in the parts department. And he was standing in the doorway in the middle of the photo here. And he noticed a number of customers and employees standing outside looking up into the sky. And curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to go out and see what they were looking at. And he observed a formation moving from right to left that eventually disappeared behind the tree line, behind the garage. And I'm going to play a segment, just a small segment of an interview I did with him in 2014.
But these things were a cluster. I don't know whether they were 6, 8, 10, 12, a group, and they stayed pretty much in formation, and they go dark. And when I said saucer plate, I don't mean it was a saucer plate. Right. That's what it really related to from the ground. Because we see airplanes up there. We know they're huge, but they are mini up there, 6 inches. I don't know how high it was.
Yeah.
I don't know how big it was. Relatively, at that point up there, it looked maybe a saucer. I never played a saucer, you know, it wasn't big. I don't remember seeing them as individuals as much as I did the formations. I don't remember whether they were just scattered on the exact formation. I know they were all together.
Okay.
When they made course changes abruptly, they pretty much stayed in those formations.
Okay.
They didn't scatter.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to move forward because normally I play a longer segment of the audio file, but later I was able to secure an on-camera interview as I got to know Marler much better, and he invited me to his home. And this is a segment from the video interview that I conducted a year later with Marler. There we go.
I guess someone came inside and said, there's strange things up in the air. So among a lot of the other people in the dealership and people on Main Street, we went out and started looking. And lo and behold, right very close there, up at an angle of maybe 60 degrees or so, or a little more, there's a flotilla of something flying up there. And I stayed and looked at it for a little while and then had to go back into, I don't know, business or something called me back. And for several days after that, I guess the same thing occurred. I understand. It was the first day.
And did you notice any sound? Do you recall any sound?
No, I don't recall any sound at all.
Okay.
And I don't remember it was a clear day. I don't know if the wind was blowing, but there's no storm around or anything. They're just more or less a blob up there. They were not defined. I couldn't say they were triangulated. They weren't round. I don't know how to describe them. They were irregular shaped because they're so far away. And as far as formation, they weren't blowing to and from, intermingling with each other. They weren't strictly formation as we would define it today, pretty jumbled together, but they stayed that way, separated. I don't remember them intertwining back and forth like a wind would do with a group of blowing leaves. Subsequently, we had a lot of, several branches of the government came in. I don't know whether the FBI came in and interviewed me, and others in town. I had the same story that I told them. I didn't know what I saw. I saw something. I can't deny that. But I don't know what it was. I don't know how fast they were going, how high they were, anything about them except I saw something.
So that's one of the rare interviews we have with a witness from that time period. Now, what's interesting to note is that while this was playing out on the one end of the state, on the far east side of the state, we also had similar sightings occurring in an area called Tucumcari. And as noted in the local paper, around 9:15 on the Friday morning, shortly before the saucers were sighted at Farmington, we had two witnesses that described seeing a flying disc, a UFO that was seen flying overhead. Now, that was just a prelude of things to come. On that afternoon in Tucumcari, it says reports came into the Tucumcari Daily News from all sections of this town. And Richard Everett, the editor of the Daily News, said that all of the descriptions were of a saucer type of disc. He said one report had a red object among the group of saucers. Another recurrent report was that the objects seemed to be playing in the sky, turning sideways, clearly showing they were saucer-like discs. And that's a common theme with regard to this series of sightings. Witnesses stated as the objects would tilt or be at an angle, they could view the object from different perspectives, and they got the appreciation that it was some type of disc-shaped UFO or disc-shaped object. So it's very interesting. These were long-duration sightings in some cases. Now, As if that's not interesting enough, we actually had a group of military witnesses standing on the tarmac at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico on Friday, March 17th at approximately 3 p.m. This is a record card from the Project Blue Book files. And as you can see noted there, they have balloon listed as the explanation. They describe 3 silver dark objects that seem to be rotating or tumbling that eventually moved over the Sandia mountain range and disappeared to the east. And there's a much more lengthy report on this, but it's interesting to note that a military sighting occurred at Kirtland in Albuquerque around the same time of these other sightings. Now, it gets very complicated because, again, many witnesses spread out over a large area. So I put together a comprehensive composite timeline. The first day, as mentioned, was Thursday, March 16th, when Marler Webb observed the UFOs, or the flying saucers. At 10 a.m., the first wave of sightings occurred over Farmington. Estimates between 3 to 5 objects, relatively small, but things, as you will see, tended to ramp up. 1 hour later, a second wave of sightings occurred, and people described anywhere from 12 to 15 objects. That was day 1. Day 2 was the big day, as you will see. We had 9:15 Tucumcari, as we saw in the newspaper article, flyover of a solitary object. 10:15 a.m. in Farmington, 5 to 9 saucers observed over Main Street. 10:30, hundreds of objects seen west of town. 10:30, red object observed, 2 revolving discs seen in the south, having a tussle in the sky, which was a quote from the newspaper accounts. 10:30, approximately, revolving discs swooping and swerving and turning like a top were reported. 10:35, 3 objects staged a dogfight in the sky. 11 a.m., sighting of a solitary saucer-shaped object that circled town. 11 o'clock, 2 metallic UFOs seen. 11:15 to 11:30, swarm of hundreds of objects observed. Red objects seen yet again, departed to the northeast with a sudden burst of speed. 2 p.m., silvery object shaped like a rectangle with rounded ends was seen moving in a westerly direction. 3 p.m., fleet of hundreds flying in formation from the northeast heading to the southwest. 3 p.m., the Kirtland Air Force Base sighting we just discussed. And then also, later in the afternoon, with no specific times offered, Las Vegas, New Mexico had a flyover of multiple objects, as did Tucumcari, New Mexico. Flyover of multiple objects with red object observed. So a very, very busy day. And then, as if that wasn't enough, on at least Saturday morning between 11 and 12, there was another wave of multiple objects that were seen. And so that's the composite timeline. Now, despite the severity of sightings, the rash of sightings that were taking place, isn't it interesting when you go into the Air Force records and look at the official cases? For March 1950, if we go down the roster here, if we look for the 16th, 17th, and 18th, there is absolutely zero reference to Farmington, New Mexico. But that's not to say that they weren't interested. There's no official case file on this incident, despite thousands of eyewitnesses. But in going through Air Force files, I found Air Force OSI spot intelligence reports where they clearly did, as Marler Webb alluded to, came out and interviewed witnesses. And in this particular instance, the reports reference sightings on March 16th, the first day. And again, remember that date of March 16th when we get into the official explanation. So these are what the documents look like when I first came across them. They're redacted, and they've basically been declassified for some time, although we have the redactions. I tried to see if I could try to secure the unredacted files, and I had noted that as early as 1985, they still were classified. So I filed a FOIA request, and in 2017, I was able to secure the unredacted documents. And in fact, the archivist at the National Archives stated these actually were declassified back in 2014. But, as often is the case, they declassify these and they don't send out any notices or advertisements. But all Air Force OSI documents pertaining to this period regarding UFOs, apparently, according to the archivist, are now unredacted. And so what's interesting about this is these documents yield new insights. And quite often I have people say, well, Dave, why do you investigate these old cases? This is one of the reasons, because it's decades later before we actually get new insights into the case, because we have to wait for many of these documents to be declassified. In this particular instance, we found the name of another witness that we never had on record before, Mr. Robert Reen, and the name is misspelled there. And I talked to Marlo Webb about this gentleman when I discovered these documents. And Marlo said, oh, yeah, he was my brother-in-law. And so Robert was working with Marlo at the Perry Smoke Garage on the first day, on the 16th. And this basically recounts their sighting. But also, another name came out as a result of the unredacted documents, Mr. Hulan Pace. And this is very interesting because in the document, Hulan Pace is referenced, but I was obviously familiar with his name as a result of my FOIA request. Just recently, and I think I've mentioned this on social media, there was a new discovery pertaining to this particular case, new insights into the Farmington, New Mexico incident. About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Barry Greenwood, who I believe is in the audience listening to the lecture today, and Jan Aldridge, we were on a three-way phone call. And during the course of conversation, Barry mentioned that he was looking into a case from Alaska. I believe it was October 6th, if I'm not mistaken, 1950. And so while the three of us are having a discussion, I walked over to the case files. I said, well, let me see if I have anything on that. And I went to the historic NICAP CUFOS files, which I acquired in November. And as they're talking about this Alaska case, I interrupted and I said, gentlemen, I said, I just discovered something and I'm just in shock right now. And what I discovered was this. There was a report form from NICAP dated 1968. And it was an interview with Hulan Pace. If anyone else were to find this report and see that name, it wouldn't register. I immediately was attracted to the name, and I started looking at the description. It was a detailed description of what he observed during the incident in Farmington in 1950, and it matched other details. However, the file was misfiled under October 1950 for God knows how many decades. And so I found new information as a result of this report. What you see here on the screen, we have two new additional witness names. There was a Slim Moore and an Abe Huntsman that were with Marlo and Robert Green, or Bob Green, working at the garage that day, and they observed the UFO. So new insights into witness names 71 years later after the incident. But the one thing that we never truly had regarding this case, despite the interviews and the notes, were eyewitness sketches. And to my surprise, the last 2 pages of the report had, and I'm showing this for the first time publicly, sketches by one of the witnesses from March 1950. The first sketch shows the objects as they approached. And here's Farmington Airport. And here is the Chevrolet garage where Hulan was working, approximately 5 miles distance, he notes here. He shows that the objects came in single file. They started doing erratic acrobatics in the air. And you can see here, dogfight area, which was the term used in the newspapers from the time. And then after engaging in some type of dogfight, they then took off in this direction. Then the next sketch we have is a detailed sketch of what the individual objects look like. Here you can see side view, normal flight, and then side view, slightly tilted position, showing a roughly elliptical or roughly circular shape. These, after 71 years, are the first eyewitness sketches we have pertaining to the Farmington incident. And just to give you some context, this is an aerial photo showing the historic downtown Farmington area on the right. You see the airstrip, which is actually on top of a mesa, just like it was in 1950. And so this shows, the arrow here shows the direction the objects came in from. The elliptical area here shows where the dogfight took place. And the yellow circle there indicates roughly where Hulan was at when he observed this. So new insights after 71 years, which again underscores why we can never close these cases and we can always come up with new insights. But I can't tell you how excited I was to find new witness names and more specifically sketches pertaining to this incident. So all this information, what's the official explanation? And I like to call this portion of my presentation Debunking the Debunkers, and you'll see why momentarily. So Project Blue Book. Dr. Donald Menzel, who is a historic debunker of UFOs, in 1963 in his book mentions the Farmington Flying Saucer Armada. However, he references it as only occurring on one day, March 17th, which just happened to be St. Patrick's Day. I think you can understand the subtext of that implication that the people in Farmington were drinking, they hallucinated, and that explains the Farmington incident. However, he explained this whole incident as a skyhook balloon that had been launched from Holloman Air Force Base near White Sands missile range that drifted over Farmington and ruptured. And what people basically saw were little plastic fragments from the balloon that were flittering down and getting caught in the wind. And that's what people described. Well, that's interesting. But when we start looking at additional information, first, if this were true, it doesn't account for the other 2 days of sightings. Second, Dr. James McDonald, years later, as we will see, examined this theory and found no records of any balloon launch at Holloman Air Force Base, as stated by Dr. Menzel. And third, why don't the dates correspond with the Air Force Spot Intelligence report? If you recall, those investigations were pertaining to the Thursday, March 16th sightings. So I don't think that necessarily comports with Dr. Menzel's theory. So unfortunately, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt echoed that same explanation in his book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, stating the incident was caused by a skyhook balloon bursting at high altitude. But when we look at all of these incidents and times and the geographic spread across the state of New Mexico, Albuquerque, Tucumcari, Las Vegas, Santa Fe, as well as the area around Farmington, it's really stretching the imagination to think a skyhook balloon dispersed over the entire state over all these different periods of time. And people were describing not only silver discs, but red objects. How would a skyhook balloon account for a red leader that was seen moving faster and that was larger than the rest of the objects? So I like to end it by saying, even though the skyhook balloons were launched with helium and lifted into the air, I think Menzel's theory was supported with a lot of hot air. But when we look at other government documents, when we look at Air Force Office of Special Investigation documents, I stumbled across this one. It says unidentified aerial objects were observed over Los Alamos, Sandia Base, New Mexico on February 25th, March 4th, March 22nd, April 1st. Objects were of the general type of those observed in the New Mexico area during the daytime. Now, what's interesting is this was pertaining to the green fireballs, not to daylight discs. And the fact that they reference objects being seen during the daytime, and you see the time frame from February to April, they must have been alluding to the Farmington incident, even though they didn't have an official file on it. An unofficial explanation that was offered by State Patrolman Andy Andrews, he told the local newspaper, which ran with it, that, well, people were just seeing little bits of cotton floating in the air. And that explains the entire UFO incident. And what he was referring to is a desert milkweed or silkweed that grows out here in New Mexico. And it gets these little cottony tufts that blow around in the air. But multiple witnesses adamantly denied this. They stated there is no way that what I saw was cotton. One partial explanation for some of the UFO sightings during this time was the fact that Venus could be sighted during the daytime. And for some of the witnesses that looked up because they had heard about the other reports, if they saw a solitary object sitting stationary, some of those could possibly have been the planet Venus that people described. So as with any UFO investigation, it's separating the wheat from the chaff. So some of the reports may have been that, but certainly not the multiple objects that we're seeing flying in formation. Now, I thought this was particular note. Dr. Lincoln La Paz at the University of New Mexico, who was investigating the green fireballs, was very skeptical. He was a true scientist, but he made this comment in the Farmington Times. At the very end there, he said, in his opinion, the reported sightings of a mass flight of saucers or strange objects over Farmington recently belongs in the, quote, quite serious, unquote, class. And if that's not enough to have a scientist of his standing weighing in on the subject, let's go to Dr. James McDonald. For those of you that have heard my lectures before, I hold Dr. McDonald in the highest regard. I find him to be one of the most dogged historical UFO researchers to date. And he did a lot of work, and Ann Druffel wrote the book Firestorm on his life and on his work, as well as the UFO field at that time. But at Dr. James McDonald, when he passed away, all of his materials, all his research papers and audio recordings were donated to the University of Arizona, where he was a teacher and an atmospheric physicist for many years. And I went to the archives. You can actually go and visit Tucson. And I highly encourage anyone, if you're interested in UFOs and UFO history, please make a trip to the university in Tucson. The staff are absolutely outstanding. They have wonderful facilities there. And in 2015, at the request actually or suggestion of Stanton Friedman, he suggested that I look into that because he thought James had looked into the case decades ago back in the 60s. So I did go there, and I did find his original documents, his handwritten notes from interviews with witnesses. Lots of interesting insights. We won't be able to go into all of it today, but those are some of Dr. McDonald's original handwritten notes pertaining to the case and the interviews. Regarding floating cotton or debris that we talked about, these are just some excerpts. Not cotton or paper, something very different, said the witness. Not cotton, he feels. Andy Andrews came up later joking, there goes 5 or 10 of them, cottonwood. And then the person says, that big orange one wasn't cotton, he said. So you have a lot of different things. And also references to the red leader that I mentioned earlier. How many objects did he see? 20 to 30 in a formation. One red one leading them. And then, as you can see, could see at times one round one, color of a paper bag, brown. Big red orange object. And another person described it as a rusty colored disc. And in the upper right, all of the objects were of a silvery color, except for the one red saucer. And what's interesting about that is it made me think back to this historic UFO photo. I only use this for illustrative purposes. I can't speak to the credibility of this photo, but I think based on these varying descriptions, they were describing a rusty, dark red or brownish red object specific to that red leader. So I just use that as maybe an example of what that color was with regard to this leader. Now, Dr. James McDonald did not only conduct interviews, he recorded his interviews, and courtesy of the University of Arizona Library Special Collections Group at Tucson, what I want to do is just share some quick clips with you of some interviews that he conducted. This is with Mr. Clayton Body, and this was conducted January 6th, 1968. Just a side note, I actually tracked down Ron Body, who is the son of Clayton Body, who actually lives and works here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I've gotten to know Ron quite well. When I played this for him, this recording, on one of the meetings that we had, he said, David, he goes, I never heard that side of the conversation, but I remember sitting with my father when he got the call from Mr. McDonald. So it was really interesting to bring back memories. But here is just a segment from the interview that Dr. McDonald conducted.
Hello, Mr. Body. My name is Professor McDonald with the University of Arizona. I'm calling you from Tucson. I'm doing some work currently on the UFO problem, and I'm digging into some of the older cases to try to check back on what was involved in some of them. I'm calling you to ask if you would have a minute to spare a couple of questions about that classic incident in Farmington back in 1950 when a rather large number of objects were seen. Would you be able to spare 10 minutes at the moment? The cotton hypothesis was pretty well brushed aside before the thing was even cold, wasn't it?
Oh, I think so. As well as the burning paper and all the other jazz you hear about.
Yeah. Well, the one that still stands, as far as I can tell, in the Wright-Patterson files, I've been with Wright-Patterson several times looking into this, is the ruptured balloon idea. I have written to Holloman to try to get actual data on whether there even was a balloon over there, and I'm contacting some balloon people about breakup. But as one of the witnesses, how would you appraise that hypothesis that it was a fragmented balloon?
I mean, I would question it. It didn't appear to me to be that at the time, let's say.
Did they seem to be substantial objects of discernible...
Substantial objects.
So your feeling would be that it wasn't likely to be fragments of plastic?
I don't think it would be likely to be.
Did they move at high angular velocity, or did they flutter down, or what kind of motions were perceptible?
It would appear to me to be fairly high angular, perhaps, but I don't know. I'm not enough of science to know.
The objects were not simply coming down.
Yeah.
They were moving across the sky at times.
Yeah.
And were they all moving in the same direction?
Yeah.
Do you remember what that was?
Yeah. Let's see. They were moving in the northwest.
Towards or from?
Toward.
Towards the northwest. About how long do you think objects were observable? Was it?
Golly, I don't know. 2 or 3 guys, and I sat there and looked at them and said, how about that? We watched them for some time, and then I went on back to the newspaper because they finally went out of sight. I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes, I suppose.
That's in the case of your own observation.
Yeah.
And were there others who did observe them later in the day, as far as you know?
I don't know whether later in the day. I happened to be with 2 or 3 people when we observed them, and I'm sure their attitude is a little like mine. They kind of shrugged their shoulders and so on, because we weren't sure of it. This happened about, maybe 9 o'clock in the morning.
How many objects were there when you saw them? Do you recall roughly?
Oh, I wouldn't have any idea. I would say it was a group.
Like as many as half a dozen?
Oh, yeah, I think it's more than that.
More than half a dozen. Several dozen? Or what kind of a ballpark guess is involved there?
Oh, I would say between 20 and 30.
30. And were they in that range? Were they in any formation?
Yes, they were.
What kind of formation?
Well, I felt that there was one red one that appeared to be leading them.
Distinctly red.
Others that were following the formation in silver.
And was it V or what? Line?
No, I don't think it was. Not as I think back and looking at ducks moving south and that kind of thing. I don't think it was in a V formation. It looked like a group of things in the air with one red leader.
So you're going to hear that echoed time and time again. Despite the fact that these objects were in formation, none of the witnesses stated that they were flying in a V formation, which is interesting when we get to talking about the photographic evidence or purported evidence. Now, as Dr. McDonald alluded to, he did contact Office of Naval Research, and these are his actual handwritten notes. January 29th, 1968, phoned Dombrowski from hotel in D.C. He said checked all ONR records and no, underlined, skyhook flights anywhere in country on March 17th or March 18th. Nearest flight in time was released from Minnesota and terminated over Michigan. So completely debases the official argument that it was a skyhook balloon. And then he notes, and by the way, he would abbreviate Farmington with FMN in his notes. At Farmington, the UFOs moved rapidly across sky, maneuvered irregularly, and did not behave at all like plastic fragments. And then he went on to add, based on the meteorological data, any Alamogordo skyhook launch would have gone to Texas, not Farmington. So very interesting information. Now, we have to wonder about radar data. Back in 2018, I went to Maxwell Air Force Base with my wife. We met up with Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, who were doing historical research on the Aztec UFO crash. And I did come across the historical data with regard to radar coverage. And Kirtland Air Force Base shows that it had radar coverage extending all the way up to Trinidad, Colorado. But also there was a top secret radar facility at Elevado, New Mexico, which is not too far from Farmington. So there would have been radar coverage, but as far as trying to gather radar data, it's sketchy at best after all these years. Now, I did have a Mr. Todd Jones reach out to me, and he had family members that had observed UFOs. And just like with Clayton Body, the family was nice enough to share photographs with me. These are 2 witnesses mentioned in the newspaper, Mrs. Wilson Jones, actually Billy Louise or Maggie Jones, and Mrs. Roy Hicks, as they were referenced in the newspaper, and Mrs. Lori Hicks. And here's a photo of the 2 of them circa 1950 in Farmington. Dr. James McDonald interviewed both of them. Neither were able to really provide much detail, but I do just want to let you hear Miss Lori Hicks and what she had to say.
Well, about all I can say is we did see something. I don't know what.
Did they pass directly overhead, or were they a long way from your location?
Oh, I don't remember exactly, but they weren't right exactly over us, but not too far from us.
And were they moving in a straight course, or was there anything unusual in the way they moved through the air?
Well, they were kind of in a formation, if that's what you mean.
Was it a V?
No. Well, there were too many of them to be a V. I don't know. They were just, I just don't know how to catch it.
I see. But they moved moved along in straight fashion, somewhat like aircraft or geese or something like that. They were moving straight rather than, were they any bouncing around or erratic motions that you recall?
Well, no, not exactly.
Let's see. Okay.
So not much information, but at least we have more witness testimony. Now, someone who did provide a tremendous amount of information, and another witness that's still alive today, is Mr. Virgil Riggs. I was put in touch with him through my friends Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, and he was a third grader in Aztec, New Mexico. And for those that aren't familiar, Farmington is down in the lower left here, and Aztec is just about 16 miles or so to the northeast. And many of the objects were reported moving over Farmington towards the Aztec area. And the graphic you see here is a rendition of what he described seeing on multiple days. He said they looked like white dots lined up like 6 dominoes, in some cases that spread across the sky. And I was very happy to actually get a photograph of Virgil, what he looked like in 1950 as a third grader. And here's just a small segment of the interview that I've conducted with him over the years.
I didn't see him right away, but I went outside, and all these older kids were outside at recess. They were looking up. They pointed them out to me and said, "Hey, look here what we got." It was pretty interesting. I thought it was just downright cool. You know, I'd never seen anything like that before. I didn't know what they were, but everybody standing around with their mouth open looking up. The first day, we saw maybe 12 or 15 squares, and I say squares because these things were in a very geometric formation, you know, like patches on a quilt. And but you look up at them, and they look like dominoes, you know, like you'd have 9 or 12 of them, and they were just dots. They look like silver shiny dots, and as you look up at them, you'd see maybe 9 or 12 of them in a formation. And there were always extra dots floating around outside the formation. They would fly into the formation, and it looks like they would bump another one out the other side, and it would rattle around, and you'd go places and do things and find another formation. And you know, there were more in the formation than there were floating around loose. And it seemed like every time one would go into a formation, another one would have to come out of the formation. That first day, there were probably 12 or 15 of them that we were looking at. And then the second day, they were horizon to horizon. Yeah, you just couldn't count them all. Like in a quilt pattern, and they still had the same thing going on, you know, different dots moving amongst the patterns. If they were moving at all, they were moving from the southwest to the northeast, but they seemed to be fairly stable and very slow moving if they were moving at all. Looking back on my pilot experience, I would say they were airline level. Maybe at that time, airline level would have been above 13,000 feet, 13 to 30,000 feet, somewhere in that area. The first day, there were like some high cirrus clouds moving, you know, wind clouds. And then the second day was very clear. Things stood out like very vividly. And then the third day, there were a lot less. I would say there were probably 30 of these squares. And we never saw them again after that.
If they were moving southwest to northeast, and assuming, of course, that they were on a straight line path this entire time, that would have brought them over Farmington, heading over Aztec.
General area, yes.
And so on all three instances, as far as you can recall, they were moving in that same direction, that same trajectory?
Yes, I believe so.
And how many school children roughly do you think were out there with you at any given time during recess?
So I would imagine it would have been anywhere between 35 and 40.
Any rough times that you might have seen these objects during those 3 days?
Yeah, I would say morning recess would have been about 9 o'clock. And then we had an hour for lunch.
That'd be at 12 noon?
Yeah, and then again, probably 2:30. And then we were out of school by 4.
Do you recall seeing those after school as well, or was it primarily during recess?
I don't recall seeing them after school, although they probably were there. We were standing around outside there looking up, and we all thought it was pretty neat. We didn't know what it was, but it didn't appear to pose any threat to us. I do remember our teacher, our class teacher, was visibly shaken. She was even crying a little bit. I think You know, we thought, well, this is strange. We were disappointed when they didn't come back.
You were after 3 days, you were getting used to seeing them up there.
Yeah, well, we thought it was kind of fun.
So that was Virgil Riggs. I was actually happy. The very first public lecture I did locally in Albuquerque, Virgil Riggs, despite battling the flu, actually drove from the state of Missouri and came and attended a lecture, and he was interviewed by local media, which I'd love to share with you here. Just a real brief clip, and it really echoes what he said during my initial interview. And I've interviewed him several times, and he's always been consistent in his testimony over the years. But this is Virgil Riggs.
Square-looking formations in the sky. They were made up of dots, and the dots would shift from one formation to another.
Virgil Riggs was 8 in March 1950. He and other kids on the playground spent recess staring at the objects for 3 days in a row.
The first day there were a few. The second day there were too many to count. And the third day there were maybe 30 or 40 of them left.
Riggs is just one of a few living witnesses found by researcher David Marler.
I think you need to be skeptical with regard to the UFO subject, but for those that have actually taken the time to look at the data and do a systematic analysis, there is smoke.
Now he's trying to figure out what the fire is. Marler says the government maintains a research balloon exploded and people saw floating pieces of plastic, but he says that simply just doesn't match up with what happened.
I could appreciate or accept the balloon theory if it was only on one day, but how does it explain 2 to 3 days worth of sightings?
And he says it wasn't just people in Farmington who saw it. Marler says there's documented statements from witnesses across the state, including at Kirtland Air Force Base. In Rio Rancho, Robert Richardson, Action 7 News.
And that was a really good, serious piece on the case. And I just want to mention that first lecture in the audience, you could see his back, was Ron Body, the son of Clayton Body, as well as the grandson, I might add, who joined and attended that lecture. And so I have to tell you, the families that I've met with, they truly appreciate doing this historical research to provide credibility and to counter any negative statements made regarding this case, where people are trying to relegate these individuals as a bunch of drunks from Farmington or people that just simply hallucinated. The families truly appreciate honoring the memory of their deceased loved ones and trying to honor their eyewitness testimony. And with that, looking at this, we also have written testimony, not just a recorded testimony by witnesses. One of the primary witnesses was John Eaton. And May 12th, 1950, he wrote an affidavit and sent it to Dr. McDonald, which I have a copy of. What's interesting, though, is Dr. McDonald's reply, February 3rd, 1968. He states, "Thanks very much for that statement which you sent concerning the 1950 sighting of unidentified objects over Farmington. I'm pleased to have that for inclusion in reference to my files. From all the interviews that I now have and other information bearing on that case, it seems to me to be a rather significant incident." And that's from Dr. James McDonald. Found that to be very interesting. Just real quick, I normally have these animated, but I don't know if they're going to play since I'm not in presentation mode. But Johnny Eaton described these objects as having the ability to hover, move short distances, hover again. He described them having a wobbling motion when they would be hovering, which is very reminiscent of other UFO cases. The objects appear to be round or flat depending on the object's motions, and again, depending on perspective. Another one was the fact that many of these silver objects were seen flying like a coiled spring that would like rotate and either go down or go up. And then often they would just do a complete vertical ascent. Again, another one, there were objects that were repeatedly bumping off each other. One would run into the other and then bounce back. And then one of the witnesses in Dr. James McDonald's interview stated they actually had a spotting scope where they were actually able to zero in on one of the objects. And this is a sketch from another UFO incident, but I found it to be eerily similar to the witness description. They described a cigar-shaped object, silver in color, with vertical windows or bands across it. So that was the first instance we had ever heard of with an aided eye, not the unaided eye, where someone was able to zero in on an object and get detail. And then Bob Fouts was another witness. He described fast-moving objects that would turn suddenly, make right-angle turns, and make erratic turns in different directions. And then another one was Don Hodgson. He described the big red-orange object which shot across the sky. He said it actually turned on end and then shot up vertically like a rocket. And he said it sure went out of sight fast somehow. Now, the title of the article is, Farmington, New Mexico and beyond. And I just want to let you know that what was occurring here in Farmington was a wave of UFO activity that stretches from Colorado all the way down to Mexico City, at least. These are listings of cities where I have many other cases that were reported from the time. And we won't go into detail, but you can see here the third time within a week that strange objects were reported over Mexico City and over the city of Durango. And so that was on Monday, March 8th. During the week, and that coincides, if you recall, with the Eunice, New Mexico sighting of the red object. Then we have Monday, March 13th. We have the objects being seen over Mexico City as well as Monterey. And then we also have sightings occurring on March 16th, where the objects were not only seen by airport personnel, but they were actually filmed. And it's interesting, there's a number of newspaper accounts describing the filming of these UFOs, but no subsequent articles could I find referencing when the film was developed and what it actually yielded as far as information. Another case occurred right over Dallas on Thursday, March 16th, day number 1 of the Farmington incident. And a recruiting officer at the Dallas Naval Air Station said he saw a B-36 bomber, and then he suddenly saw this silver object streak directly underneath the aircraft, and then it shot off at a 45-degree angle and disappeared. On Friday, March 17th, the big day in Farmington, we had multiple objects being seen over Brownsville, Texas, as well as over Mexico City and over other areas of Mexico, just south of Brownsville. And you can see here the headlines that it was garnering. Still more saucers. 50 persons report discs over New Mexico, Cuba, and Mexico. So a lot of activity going on at the time. Despite the witnesses, despite the sightings, despite the prevalence of newspaper accounts, the official statements at the time were this: Air Force says saucers are imaginary, and Major DeWitt Searles, said, no, 1,000 times no. As far as the Air Force goes, there's no such thing as a flying saucer. Well, I think people in Farmington would argue with that point. But unfortunately, it would also go to more dastardly claims and statements like this one. U.S. military men dismiss subject as so much moonshine. Again, the witnesses at the time found this to be insulting, and when I shared this with some of the living witnesses to the witnesses, or the witness families, to the witnesses who are now deceased, they found that to be insulting to the memory of their family members. Now, we get into an area of photographic evidence. If these objects were seen 3 full days, many people say, well, how come photographs weren't taken? Well, we only have one photograph that's been attributed to the Farmington incident, and this actually came through Open Minds magazine. It was posted on their website back in October 11th, 2013, and it was a photograph from the Wendell Stevens photo archive. And you can see here a UFO over Farmington, New Mexico, March 17th, 1950. And the YouTube video, which I believe is still available, goes into describing how this was discovered in Wendell's collection. Interesting thing about it is on the back, there was a handwritten notation, Farmington, New Mexico. And that's the only attribution we have. Now, I have a photograph here, and I apologize since I can't do presentation mode. I can't show you this, but this is a positive image or a negative image of a positive photograph that I acquired July 2015. And this is from a London Newswire service. And it's an original 1950 stamped and dated March 1950 photograph. And it shows the same image that Wendell has here. But as you'll note, this photograph was heavily cropped, whereas this actually shows much more around the objects that are prominent in the photo. If we do a photo comparison, you can see them side by side. Clearly, it's the same photograph, although this one is cropped. Now, on the back of mine, I have an original news report describing this as being seen, objects being seen and photographed. And you can see here Fleet Street, London. But despite the fact that I have the photo, despite the fact that one was found in Wendell's collection, virtually no references exist when you go through the historical records as I have. Amy Michel, the French author and researcher, in his book from 1956, does have the photo in The Truth About Flying Saucers, but he labels it simply Another American Photograph of Flying Saucers, which is interesting because I really wanted to get into the history of this. Now, when we look at the back of the photograph that Wendell had, you see here, it says March 17th, but then someone wrote over 18th, or 18th March 1950, 10:15, Farmington, New Mexico. When we enhance this a little bit, you can see this paper manufactured by Kodak. This paper was created and used primarily in the 1970s and 1980s. So clearly this is a later reprint compared to the 1950 vintage copy, which I have, which there you can see the stamp on the back, as well as the news teletype. It took me over a year and a half to try to track down the origin of this photograph because there were conflicting statements. I even found this in a French newspaper, attributing it to a French UFO case. But ultimately, I found the source, which was this: a very small, obscure newspaper called the Teenage Times out of Dublin, Ireland, dated March 24th, 1950, not long after the Farmington incident, same month, same year. And here you see, suspension bomb threatens the world. It shows the photograph of the UFO with the clouds, and it puts forth the idea that are these flying saucers some type of top secret weapon that we could use to bomb other countries. And it's interesting that the newspaper was only in existence for about a year, year and a half, but this is the source of the photograph. But something that I noticed when I originally obtained a copy of this, and by the way, this was never digitally available. I actually had to request a digital copy off the only hard copy edition that they had at the National Library in Dublin, Ireland. But here is a blow up of the photo from the newspaper, and admittedly it's grainy. I apologize for the photo quality. But there was something that was similar yet different that I couldn't put my finger on. And so when you compare the two, here's the original photo, and here's the photo from the Teenage Times. I outline the cloud formation, so you can see those a little bit more prominently, and you can see here and here clearly the same cloud formations. The dotted line here shows where this photo was cut off on the right, and vice versa. That's just showing you where the crop marks are on the alternate photos. But if you notice, when you look at the prominent objects, the 5 prominent objects here, they're different relative to the cloud formation from one photo to the other. And what's interesting about this is apparently there was at least 2 successive photos taken of these objects in the sky, whatever they are. And again, I apologize, I don't have the ability to show this in presentation mode, but you can see here the red circles where I overlay the 2 photos, and it's showing you where the objects are in relation to the 2 photos. So 2 sequential photos of the same objects apparently in flight. We know the photo was taken prior to March 24th because that's when it was published in the Teenage Times. Still not known really where the photo was taken because the article doesn't state where the photo was taken. It simply includes it as part of the article. And we still don't know who took the famous photo. But the objects, all we can say is that they're unknown. Now, what's interesting about this is not the objects themselves, but rather the clouds that you see in the photograph. These appear to be cumulus clouds, not cirrus clouds, as was widely reported and as meteorological data suggests from Farmington, March 1950 on those 3 dates, the 16th, 17th, and 18th. All reports stated it was either clear or a light scattering of cirrus clouds. These are not cirrus clouds. So that is really suggestive of the fact that this was not taken in Farmington, New Mexico, or over Farmington, New Mexico. And so when we look at this, you know, we have to ask, could this be a photo from Farmington? Well, the clouds tend to rule that out, but also the objects are in a V formation. As you can read and you can hear from many witnesses, at least 3 to 4 witnesses stated the objects were never seen in a V formation. So I think that we have to be highly skeptical of any attribution of this photo being tied to Farmington. But what's interesting is this. One eyewitness in Farmington, a naval veteran and private pilot, described the UFO spectacle as an object appearing to be red that was at the center of the formation surrounded by silvery discs. And he went on to state they were perfect replicas of a dinner plate, even down to the bottom ring. And he said 6 other people saw it with him, and that was from the Lubbock Morning Avalanche. And when you zero in on the main object in this photo, you see a circular object and what looks like a ring, as if it is like a dinner plate. So questions remain. Why are there no photos published in the Farmington Daily Times following the sightings? And why isn't the photo published in any American newspapers subsequent to the Farmington sightings? And I've gone through exhaustive newspaper archives online, as well as microfilm and the hard copies that I have here. And why does Amy Michelle reference it as another American flying saucer photo? He doesn't give any attribution as to the source. And why does it seem to originate from an obscure Irish newspaper that only was around for about a year and a half? And ultimately, who took the photo and where did they take it? So is the photo even genuine? And to that point, I actually was a supporting contributor to a paper that was written focusing on this photograph. And Spanish researcher Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos, a veteran UFO researcher, wrote a very detailed paper tracing the history of this photo through various newspapers. And he was very kind in citing my research. And in kind, I want to cite a reference that you can look online and look at his analysis of the photo in much more detail. And so I want to thank him for his efforts. So, but yet the official policy continues with regard to UFOs in March of 1950. On March 18th, Air Force says saucers are imaginary, mass flight of sky discs seen by 5,000. And the Air Force continues to say there's no such thing as a flying saucer. What was interesting as March concluded and as we moved on into other weeks and other months in 1950, there were many other sightings across the country, but one jumped out at me. April 29th, there was a sighting, and this was in Centralia, Washington. And it was interesting to note that the witness there in Washington State stated, she said they were all of the same flat cylindrical shape, generally described by others who have reported seeing the things, but that one was tinged a dark red. So isn't that eerily reminiscent of the Farmington sightings that occurred a little over a month before? And so I just share that with you as an interesting corollary. So my conclusions are, highly anomalous objects were sighted over Farmington, New Mexico. Conventional explanations do not fit all the facts in the case. Objects clearly demonstrated some type of powered flight and intelligent maneuvering. High altitude objects and low altitude objects were observed. Purported photograph may show the same or similar objects as reported over Farmington, but the evidence suggests the photo originated elsewhere. And what occurred over Farmington was just part of the overall wave of UFO activity at that time, stretching down into Mexico. And the origin and nature of the flying saucers was and is still unknown. But in the final analysis, I always like to pose it to you. What do you think occurred in March of 1950? Were all of the witnesses delusional? Were all of the witnesses lying? Would you believe the Air Force that all of the witnesses were drunk? Because according to them, this all just happened on St. Patrick's Day, which we know is not true. And do you believe the Air Force's explanation that it was a skyhook balloon that ruptured? If not, then we must be open to the possibility that something highly unusual occurred. This case is certainly suggestive that we are dealing with someone else's technology. We can't be more specific than that. Collectively, we can work towards finding definitive answers, but individually, you must arrive at your own conclusions. And so with that, I want to thank you. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties. And Alejandro, I'll see if I can switch it back over to you, if I can stop sharing my screen. There we are.
All right. So we do have some questions, a couple questions here. And of course, anybody out there watching, and we got quite a few, feel free to type in your answers. So this is from Mortimer Jones. They'd like to ask you, and actually there's a couple things here. They'd like to ask if you'd heard of UFOs that look like a town's water tower, for lack of any other description, minus the ladder and outside ring of the climbing area. And they say this is because that's what they saw when they described their sighting. They saw a huge object, almost 2 times the size of a water tower, in the air at noon on a clear day. Absolutely no movement. My driver turned a corner. I yelled to turn around. They did. Took almost 45 seconds, probably more like 30, and it was gone.
Interesting. I don't remember the term water tower being used, but there have been shapes reminiscent of a water tower. Some people have described like a bean pot. Other people have described like a top. So, you know, when you look at what I'm sitting next to here, like the historic NICAP CUFOS files, there's thousands, if not tens of files of case files here. You will find reports in all shapes and sizes. So I don't recall off the top of my head, and I apologize. There's too many cases floating around in my gray matter up here. But I think if you went through the files, you would find that many are very similar to that shape.
All right. Mortimer actually has a couple questions. Another one is what you think of the Bledsoe case.
Bledsoe case. Can you refresh my memory on that one, Alejandro?
Yeah, if you don't know, then you might not be. It's Fayetteville, North Carolina. I think it was in the 90s. It was featured on that MUFON television show that lasted about 3 episodes. It's gotten a little more popular lately due to Grant Cameron and Diana Pasulka writing about it.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, I don't remember the details on that particular one, so I apologize.
All right, and this is another one from Mortimer, but I think one that you'll have more opinions on. Do you think real disclosure is coming?
You know, Mortimer, if you would have asked me that 3 years ago, I would have probably 3 or 4 years ago, I would have probably said no. But I have to go on record and state, since the New York Times article broke in December 2017, I think you'll agree, we've seen a successive series of statements and revelations on the part of the U.S. Navy, on the part of the UAP task force, on the part of like John Brennan and many former CIA officials, as well as defense directors that are going on record and making some very interesting statements. And I feel that we're in a new era with regard to UFO research. In fact, I had an Australian film crew here, and we were discussing this just last night for an upcoming documentary. And I do feel like there's momentum, if I can use that term. I've had many people state, well, do you feel that they're going to dangle all these revelations out there, and then later they're going to go ahead and start going back to the old way of denying everything with regard to the subject, which we had for decades? My response to that is, I think the genie's out of the bottle. Too many statements have been made. We've had Radcliffe recently state that not only have these objects been seen by military personnel, they've been tracked on multiple sensing systems, which is really telling. We certainly had the Aegis radar system that detected them, in the case of the USS Nimitz incident. I feel like we're moving in a positive direction. I've never been a proponent of disclosure with a capital D, but if I can use the term, I think we're looking at gradual disclosure with a lowercase d. Oh, you're muted, Alejandro.
Thank you. I think it would be great to share with people where you're sitting right now and what you're surrounded by.
Yeah, well, I'm actually here in my research room in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And behind me is what we call the library side of the room. And immediately right here, there's 16 4-drawer file cabinets and 5-drawer file cabinets. And these are the historic NICAP UFO file collection going back to the 50s, as well as CSI New York, Civilian Saucer Intelligence New York, and the Center for UFO Study case files. Intermixed with these historic case files are the original files of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, all of his original Project Blue Book material, which is really interesting, Alejandro, because you would appreciate this. You not only have the Project Blue Book files, but you have more often than not in red felt pen commentary written by Dr. Hynek when he didn't agree with the Air Force explanation. And sometimes he was rather elaborate on describing how he thought the investigation was abysmal, how the Air Force should have investigated this. In one instance, they had, I think, ball lightning listed, and he crossed it out and he wrote unidentified in uppercase letters and underlined it 6 times. So not only do you get really interesting insights into some of the Blue Book cases, but you get insights into Dr. J. Allen Hynek and his perspective on these individual cases.
All right. And another question is, who are some of the researchers you recommend, and maybe even relist some of them that you mentioned in your lecture, such as James McDonald? I know you mentioned Ruppelt, and of course, Dr. Hynek. Those are all great.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love the work that Dr. Hynek's done over the years, and not to disparage him in any way, But for those that are familiar with Hynek and not familiar with James McDonald, I highly encourage you to look more into the man and the efforts that he, was engaged in to follow up on these historic cases. And he's a tragic individual in many ways. Again, Ann Druffel wrote the book Firestorm, and you really get insights into the man. He suffered from depression, had a lot of family issues, but also he suffered a lot of slings and arrows from his scientific peers because he was looking into the UFO subject. And I only wish people like Dr. McDonald, Dr. Hynek could be seeing the government with their more openness in talking about the subject and acknowledging the phenomenon today. But Jacques Vallée was a huge inspiration for me when I first got involved in the UFO subject. Amy Michel, the French researcher who I mentioned during the presentation, Amy Michel's books are fantastic. I absolutely loved Donald Kehoe, not only his research and his books, but his just dogged tenacity to go directly up against the Air Force in the 50s and the 60s and challenging them publicly on many instances. And in fact, a recent addition to the case files, and for those that follow me on social media, I posted this just recently, I acquired the entire NICAP audio collection of vintage reel-to-reel recordings and cassette recordings. We're in the process of getting those digitized to share those with a wide audience online. And you get to hear Don Kehoe going toe-to-toe with some of the Air Force spokesmen and public information officers. And it's really a treat. But there's a lot of good researchers out there. And unfortunately, if I can just go off on my soapbox for a minute, it's sad when you see UFO documentary after UFO documentary and the same handful or cadre of UFO researchers who have become kind of the popular talking heads. Because one, they don't speak for all of us researchers. And two, there's people doing really good work. Another researcher who I would mention more contemporary is Cheryl Costa. Cheryl's done a tremendous work with looking at UFO statistical data. In fact, she just published her second book, which Cheryl, if you ever see this show or this interview, I'm going to be ordering a copy to add to the vast library here. But she's done a tremendous amount of work looking at statistical data, which I think is important because, as I often state, it doesn't matter what you believe regarding UFOs. If you consider yourself a researcher, it only matters what the data reflects. And we have to be data driven. You can sit there and say, I believe this, I believe that. Well, you better back it up with some information. And that's what I try to do to the best of my ability. And, it really cuts through the red tape. It cuts through the misinformation, disinformation out there. And it avoids going down these rabbit holes of conspiracy theories. Focus on the data. And work is underway. I mentioned to Alejandro at the beginning, I believe Barry Greenwood is on in the audience today. Barry is going to be coming out here and spending extended periods. He's going to be a live-in researcher, if you will, along with Jan Aldridge. And they are going to continue the work they've been doing in scanning all of these historic UFO files, again, to eventually have uploaded to the internet. So you, the UFO community, will have access to that data as readily as I do now. So we don't want to just have the physical files. The goal this year in 2021 into 2022, because it'll be an extended project, is to get this information, the audio files, the case files, digitized, so you can do the research that I'm doing now with the physical files.
All right, we do have a question from Facebook. Is there any hope to recover the 3 notebooks McDonald kept his private notes in that went missing? And do you think McDonald's final demise was self-inflicted?
Yeah, and that's from Larry Lowe. I don't know with regard to the notebooks, but I have to tell you, Larry, some of the items that I found over the years that are a part of this collection, I never thought I would have. One example, just briefly, Dr. Leon Davidson, who was a prolific UFO investigator in the 50s and 60s, was always under the assumption that UFOs were some type of CIA psyops project, that UFOs weren't real, but it was something that the CIA was involved in. But despite that perspective, all of his research went to the university in New York, Columbia University. All his files, his books, and his journals one thing they don't have is this correspondence. I was put in touch with a friend of a friend of a friend who got me in touch with a self-proclaimed dumpster diver from New York State about 4 or 5 years ago. And he, in the course of dumpster diving, found all of this historical material that belonged to Dr. Leon Davidson. And I have Dr. Davidson's high school diplomas, college diploma, certificates from the War Department for his support and work on the Manhattan Project. And I have decades worth of original correspondence. Two interesting items is a letter from Lyndon Johnson, who is with the Senate subcommittee back in the 60s. And also a letter, I believe, from late 50s, early 60s from J. Edgar Hoover to Leon Davidson, as well as correspondence from Kenneth Arnold and many other people. But there's something that we thought was lost to time, and then suddenly it appears, you know, through the work of a dumpster diver years later, decades later. So the notebooks may surface. You know, you never know where this information is going to come from. In reference to Dr. McDonald, I do believe sincerely that it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound that ultimately took his life. If you're familiar with the details, it certainly lends to that. He did suffer from depression. He attempted to commit suicide once, which failed, which blinded him. And then I believe it was weeks or months later, as he was recovering, he then made a second attempt on his life, which unfortunately ended his life. But it's a tragic story, and I do try to honor him. I actually have a full-page Arizona Daily Wildcat newspaper here on my wall to kind of honor his memory with his photograph, and it talks about his work shortly before he did die. And it's nice because it's actually autographed by Dr. McDonald. So I always think we should pay tribute to those researchers that really pioneered the way for later researchers. And I'm going to try to do that in allocating all of this material to the University of New Mexico when I eventually die, so that the material will be preserved for future researchers.
All right, and here is a comment. So I'm not sure if you'll have a response, but it says, Dave, the Centralia Goelitzer report in the clip at the end of your presentation came from the Los Angeles Times for April 30, 1950.
Okay. All right. I don't know if I had the caption there, if the caption was wrong. So I'll look at that.
And Phoenix MUFON says, thank you, David Marler. So yes, thank you so much. An excellent presentation.
Absolutely.
Some of my favorite. Another great one. So thank you very, very much. And what about your website, or where can they go to get your book and what you're up to?
Yeah, really, everything's on my website right now. It's www.davidmarler.com. And I may even eventually upload some audio clips or some documents from the case files if I get time to do that. But I try to keep that as up to date as I can. And anybody that would like to reach out, or if you have questions, feel free to contact me through my website.
All right, great. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Great to see you.